Any questions before we begin? All right. Welcome to the Center for Humanist Inquiries, class Beyond Belief. We're on week 3, entitled Consolation. We're looking through Ricoeur's essay, Religion, Atheism, and Faith. Last week we covered 2 major points in Ricoeur's essay. The first one is this. He argued that the critiques that Freud and Nietzsche offer about religion are important and valid, especially in disclosing how we project a foundation for our values over a space of nothingness, but neither provides a way forward. So essentially, both Freud and Nietzsche say that anything that we try to say comes from heaven down, or from reason down, or any sort of transcendental space of certainty for values, and they're not about it, right? And they give really valid reasons why there's nothing there. It's excellent, it's necessary, but it's just, I think Ricoeur would argue that it's a semicolon, right? And as much as Nietzsche wants to put an exclamation point there, it just doesn't work. And it is an exclamation point, but more appropriately it should be understood as a semicolon, right? You can pause there, but there has to be something that comes after, because on its own it's disappointing. Second point. We talked about how Ricoeur posits that one path that avoids the route of accusation, which is what this turns into, right? That amorphous sense of guilt and wrongdoing that we understand as humans, right? We understand that we've done wrong, and having a source of certainty that says, this is what you've done wrong, this is why it's wrong, this is what you can do about it for absolution, feels great. Nobody really likes that God, though, right? I mean, as much as people like to feel kind of crappy about themselves now and then, like, nobody really wants that God at the source of it, even if that God will forgive. You know, so most people are okay just kind of doing away with all of this. But there has to be some other way through, right? Because we still want to have some sort of ethics that's posited somewhere. Otherwise, it's just lawlessness and Bill Murray's dogs and cats roaming around together, right? Nobody wants that. And so what Ricoeur talked about is a path that avoids the route of accusation that arises through language. And for Ricoeur, it comes from the sense of obedience. To obey initially or comes through hearing, etymologically and initially. Before we can obey a command, we have to obey the call of language that we listen to. We talked last week a little bit about just how a compliment, like, you're beautiful, or that was well done, or something, like those words move us in ways that we're obedient to, even if they're not imperatives. And that's the kind of obedience that Ricoeur finds dodging or circumventing or detouring around the path of accusation. So Ricoeur traces through some of Heidegger's thoughts to show the importance of hearkening to language itself. This mode of listening allows one to be affected by language in ways that avoid the binary of being controlled or rebelling. And that's ultimately the problem with this model, is that if all you hear are imperatives, you can either be controlled or you can rebel. And both of those have certain negative implications. To obey in terms of just hearkening opens up a path of freedom that's a lot more positive, and it has a lot better kinds of possibilities that associate with it. So that's what we talked about last week. This week, just to offer a little bit of a preview, in this section, Ricoeur describes why it is necessary for humans to move beyond their longing for consolation, a longing that the Christian conception of God has generally supplied. And this is a deeper and less apparent desire for a traditional God. Again, while many understand the need to move away from the God of judgment, fewer want to give up their ability to be comforted by a God of love, right? If the bottom has fallen out, if you're at wit's end, if you're at the bottom of all existential morasses and whatnot, it's really nice to know that God loves you, right? Or even in a reincarnation sense, like the myth of or Hinduism or something like that. Like, there's this sense of cosmic justice. And so in your darkest days, you can say, well, at least in the next life, things will be better off, right? And it offers some sort of consolation. Anytime we suffer, we want our suffering to have meaning, or to be meaningful, so that we can get through it. And a lot of what we look, the framework that we most often look to give our suffering meaning is that kind of consoling love of God. right? That sense of justice that will make things right again and make everything, and it allows us to live through it. So beginning with the discussion of how this God of love is still anchored to a logic of retribution, Ricoeur concludes this section with a discussion of Freud's work on the pleasure principle and the reality principle. So the last section on accusation spent a lot more time on Nietzsche. This time he's shifting a little bit more over to Freud to kind of extend that atheistic critique. Freud's work frames the desire for consolation as a deep human need, psychologically, but it frames the religious answers to this need as merely illusory, right? And for Freud, one of his last works was what he called Future of an Illusion. And in Future of an Illusion, he just spelled out, there's no need for religion anymore. We have science. And the illusion of this kind of transcendent God who consoles us and provides, why do we work? Why do we repress all of our sexual urges and desires? Why don't we just get trashed all the time? Why do we bother doing things? Well, it's anchored in that kind of illusion. And Freud just thinks that there's no space for it. I mean, 100 years later, he's pretty clearly wrong, right? There's still a need for religion. But I think what Ricoeur wants to argue is that you can still buy this, right? That it's still an illusion, but instead of just either accepting that illusion or rejecting it, you can move past it into something that's more authentic. It has harder roots, but they're sturdier, ultimately. And that's what Ricoeur is looking for. Are there any questions at this point? All right. Then I will erase the board. From page 455, Ricoeur starts talking about retribution. He claims that God is both the ultimate danger and the ultimate protection in a religious sense. God is both that which accuses and that which consoles. He argues that the God of morality grounds a sense of justice by ensuring that the wicked suffer and the just are rewarded through the logic of retribution. Right? And ultimately, that's what we need that space of God to do, to supply for us. Even if we're not going to get it now, somebody's going to pay for it later. And there's something that just feels right about that. This is the God also of providence, which organizes a moral worldview or moral framework. Providence is really big, especially in America, given our puritanical origins, right? There's a notion that the God that provides, or the God that has a plan for us, or the God that has a future for us, that sense of that providentiality of God feels really good. But again, what Ricoeur wants to do is look behind the curtain and see, no, it's still that God of retribution. Ultimately, that makes you say, oh, if I'm doing well, God has blessed me. If you're doing poorly, God hates you, and it's because you screwed up somewhere along the line, right? And there's something that feels kind of good about that too, at a deeply base human level. Like, yeah, you deserve your suffering. That's it. You've earned it. So stepping out from Ricoeur's argument briefly, the problems with this orientation to God, this providential one, are abundant in today's society. Clinging to this God of providence, again, is what allows the healthy to look on those who suffered as having earned or deserved it. Those who have health and money, like that whole the prosperity gospel. I mean, it's that same kind of providential logic, which is deeply, deeply twisted and flawed. Again, my humble opinion, I can't prove it. But I think there's something really radically pernicious about it that plays out as more and more of these preachers who preach the prosperity gospel are just really corrupt, right? There's an absence of love in it. And that absence of love, I think, is again tied to that notion of retribution and fatality. So it simultaneously justifies and disguises social disparity. And it does so in a way that's demonstrated and harmful to the world around us today. All right, so that's providence. Ricoeur then goes on to discuss what he calls the tragic faith. He argues that despite the prevalence and attractiveness of the providential interpretation, and this is a very old interpretation, right? Both retribution and providence are long-standing, especially in Judeo-Christianity. In spite of this, there's always been a resistance to it. And so he goes back to the figure of Job in the Hebrew Bible and claims that, quote, true faith in God is violently contrasted with this law of retribution, And he argues that this faith is, quote, an essentially tragic faith beyond all assurance and protection. Right? Nobody wants to be Job. Job suffers, and there's no meaning at all. I mean, Job's suffering is a bet between God and Satan. Totally undeserved, totally unmerited. Job receives no answer for his suffering ultimately. God's just like, I'm God. Did you make the whale? You know, did you make this? I'm God, I can do what I want. And Job has no recourse, right? There's no answer for Job. And so, but for Ricoeur, that's what it has to look like, right? If you want to get rid of the God of consolation, which kind of, as much as we don't want to, its ties to retribution make it so that we kind of need to do that, right? But to give up consolation removes us from all assurance and all protection. There's no certainty. There's no meaning. There's no safety. Nobody will come wipe your nose for you or pick you up anymore. You know, all of that's gone. And for him, that's part of what makes it a tragic faith. There's nothing that undergirds it anymore. There's no support to it. You just walk on alone. And that aloneness is pretty lonely because there's not a lot of other people who are willing to take it that far. Atheism. He then moves on to discuss atheism. And he says that minimally, atheism should involve, quote, the destruction of the God of morality, not only as the ultimate source of accusation, but also as the ultimate source of protection. And I think that makes sense now, right? Why both of those things have to go. Okay? End quote. Additionally, however, an atheism that includes a religious meaning should also include, quote, a new kind of faith, a tragic faith, that relates to the ontological God the way that Job's faith related to the covenants of his time. Right? So Job had to step, he didn't curse God, he didn't want to die, but he held himself apart from the kinds of interpretations that the biblical covenants of his time would lead him to embrace. Right? He didn't say that he had done anything wrong. He still held himself up as blameless, although he had no support for that, given the kind of worldview that was shaping all of his friends, right? And so Job mentions the three friends that speechify about how he must have done something. Just give up, Job. Come on. Seriously, man, just own it. And Job holds his ground. But there's no support for that. And he's suffering the whole time, right? I mean, his body's in agony. He's lost his family. He's lost his possessions. His friends aren't supporting him in any way, right? They're just telling him to give up. And what he has is nothing except that. Suffering without consolation. And I'm not trying to make this pretty. I'm not putting curtains and shades and window treatments on it. I mean, it's bleak, but it's honest. And it's far less reprehensible than what this looks like. But it's hard, and Ricoeur doesn't dodge that. Any questions about that so far? All right. I'm going to get a drink quick. Page 456. So rather than arguing against theodicies, so he goes through a discussion of theodicy. And theodicies are attempts to reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of God, who is claimed to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Right? And it's kind of a conundrum. If you have this God who's all-powerful, all-loving, all-great, why do we have evil? And theodicies will attempt to negotiate that delicately and in different ways. Ricoeur has no interest in that. So instead of trying to do that, Ricoeur chooses to revisit Freud and Nietzsche. And he offers two reasons why he thinks that's a superior path to the traditional road of theodicy. Number one, he says that critiquing the God of morality becomes complete once one is willing to condemn the God of refuge and protection. Right? Once you're willing to forego providence, you don't really have to worry about the problem of evil anymore. Because the only God that would need to be reconciled is that God of morality. And if you get rid of the God of morality, you can understand that you're in a world of evil. Right? And so he says that does a good enough job. Number two, though, he also says that Freud and Nietzsche go farther in their critiques than philosophers have been willing to go historically. And so he says that their attention to motivations for needing to reconcile contradictions between morality and evil, and that's something that haunts moral philosophy all through the ages, may overlook So he says that tendency, so what both Freud and Nietzsche do is analyze motives, right? They're interested in why we need to have that kind of reconciliation. And for Ricoeur, that trumps all the attempts of Kant and Leibniz and Hegel to do the reconciling, right? And he says that while it undermines the differences between how Kant does it, how Hegel does it, how Leibniz does it, right? I mean, it kind of groups them all in the same baby that they toss out with the bathwater. He says that's okay, because it provides the important work of exploring what's similar in those tendencies, and what's similar, he thinks, makes a good point. On page 457, he writes, quote, "For Nietzsche, the will that is hidden behind these rationalizations is always a weak will. Its weakness consists precisely in the recourse to a vision of the world in which the ethical principle that Nietzsche calls the ideal comes to dominate the process of reality." Right? And so for all of them, and what Ricoeur likes about that approach is the way that it exposes the reality of suffering. Right? Suffering is real. Evil is real. Evil causes a lot of the suffering, right? Things aren't fair. And what all of these theodicies try to do is import some sort of ideal of how things should be, and then they try to reconcile the real with this make-believe ideal that they're fabricating, and they're spending a lot of time doing that. And where Freud and Nietzsche come in is to look at that process and just expose it as flawed. It comes from a weak will. It comes from really wanting that ideal to be true and wanting it to be true so badly that you'll spend a lot of time and mental energy making it be okay. Where for Ricoeur, it's a lot nicer to just say, here's what we have. And again, the reason why this is important is because reality, in a lot of ways, is nothing more or less than suffering most of the time. Adding an ideal to the mix doesn't help. It just, I mean, it sounds nice. It's a nice little blanket. It feels good for a little bit, but really, the suffering is still there. And it doesn't help in a true, authentic sense of that. And so he's happier just looking at the reality of it. So for Ricoeur, there are two goals. Number one, he argues for the need to move beyond critiques of metaphysics and the need for rational reconciliation, and to search for a positive ontology beyond resentment and accusation. Right? So both Freud and Nietzsche are able to critique the metaphysics that has that ideal versus the real. Right? He says we need to go past that, though. And we need to go past the need for reconciliation of those and just embrace something that's positive. Right? Rather than just striking things down, let's look for what we can do beyond resentment and accusation. And there's got to be something, right? There has to be some way that we can relate to reality and to suffering that isn't going to fall back into that trap. And that's what he wants to explore. His claim is that this appears as a, quote, entirely non-ethical vision, end quote, which allows us to embrace Nietzsche's innocence of becoming, moving beyond good and evil. So he steals that phrase of Nietzsche's, the innocence of becoming, and the notion of moving beyond good and evil. But for him, that's the importance of the non-ethical that we talked about last week with Heidegger, right? In order to move forward beyond accusation and resentment, it has to be this. It has to go through that path. And it's only as non-ethical beings that we can see reality for what it is without getting mixed up in all of the circles of guilt or accusation or resentment. I mean, just think about how much time you spend feeling guilty about things, right? It's a major distraction and it never goes away. And so for Ricoeur, if you just dodge it, you can get straight to what matters most, and that's how to not avoid suffering. Number two, Ricoeur cautions that any solution would be necessarily temporary. it, quote, must remain an interpretation inseparable from the interpretation of all interpretations. Right? So any non-ethical path isn't going to like maintain the capital T truth that a traditional metaphysics has. Right? It's going to be temporary. It's going to be, this is what seems to work for now. I see reality as this for now. This is the best I can do for now. But it's not capital T true. Right? Because once it has that capital T, it kind of subtly erases that nod, and then it becomes ethical again. And then you have norms of right or wrong, good and evil, good and bad, and you're back to where you started. So the only way to remain humble enough to keep within a space of the non-ethical is to humble the capital T and just make it a little t truth. Like that. It's a little truth. He also says that it needs to remain invested in, quote, the network of mythology, unquote, whether classical or more modern. All of the myths say the same thing. They all proclaim the absence of guilt, i.e., the absence of the ethical character of all being. Right? And so if you look back at any myth, or any mythological framework, they all posit that human beings are essentially good. Right? There's no, I mean, or even before, I mean, this is pre-lapsarian Eden, right? Humans are essentially good. We don't need ethics. At our core, in terms of who we are, in terms of what our being is, we don't need ethics. And for Ricoeur, keeping an eye on that kind of that mythological network allows us to maintain a connection to our innocence. And again, in the Nietzschean sense, that allows us to have the innocence of becoming, which is always a goal moving forward. Right? It's always oriented toward what's possible or what's potential. It's our becoming, and it's not our being that matters. All right, any questions about that? Katie?
Isn't that, so, how does that work with like, Freud's like, future of illusion? Because like in the becoming, it's such like a mindset that's in the future, right? I don't know how to voice or word my question, but I'll just hit you up later, sorry.
That's okay. We're going to return to Freud in just a second. Okay. So if we can spell that out and you can think about your question, we can come back at that point. Is that okay? All right. Anything else for now? Yeah.
This might be a stupid question, but suffering, so like you could say that guilt is a form of suffering. So like what kind of suffering like are we working with? Like, is it an ultimate sort of like suffering with a capital S? Or...
Well, guilt is that kind of pernicious kind of suffering
right.
that we cause ourselves.
Okay, so
right?
not like the actual...
It's drama suffering, right? What's the best way to avoid thinking about my real problems is to get in a fight with my girlfriend, right? Well, now I have big problems. And by the time I work through those problems, well, oh man, now I have to pick another fight with somebody, right? And that just allows me to stay up here and not really look at what's driving those things. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
This is just an annoying little question, but like, isn't the idea of keeping the truth with a little t kind of a big T truth?
No, that's still an interpretation too, right? If you stumble onto an absolute model that really works, go for it, right? I mean, even that one you can have as a little t.
Just like always be ready to say, oh, I was wrong.
Yeah. This is the best I have to work with for now. And that's, I mean, in a lot of ways, scientists are willing to do that with their theories, right? This is the best explanatory model that I can come up with. Like, well, it doesn't explain this thing. Well, here's another model that does. Awesome, right? Now I can adapt and change to have a new model that has more explanatory value come in, rather than the old model, which didn't have these kind of outliers accounted for.
Right.
All right. Okay, time to erase the board again. All right. Page 458. Having focused primarily on Nietzsche, Ricoeur moves to a consideration of how all of this relates to Freud. He writes, quote, "The kind of mythology that is represented by the Nietzschean conception of the innocence of becoming finds its more prosaic counterpart in what Freud calls the reality principle." End quote. Freud develops the reality principle as a contrast to the pleasure principle and connects it with the concept of necessity. as an example, the pleasure principle can allow us to fantasize any number of pleasurable things. Eating a warm cookie is an awesome thing to fantasize. And when I'm hungry, I can sit and just really understand the texture of a good warm chocolate chip cookie with like oatmeal and nuts and pecans. It's just delicious, right? And I can taste it, and just the way it's held on my tongue and it's warm, and I'm still hungry, right? And so no matter how much I can wish and how really I can wish about it or fantasize, I remain hungry and unsatisfied. And I mean, when Freud talks about it in, I think it's in the interpretation of dreams, for him, that's why an infant starts to scream, right? Like an infant can fantasize about being fed, and then it's still hungry, and it's just like, this is ridiculous, right? And ultimately, for Freud, that's what gives birth to the pleasure principle, which is you can control your own reality, right? You can make any reality you want. I mean, on an adult level, you have credit cards, you have all sorts of magic that makes things happen. But for Freud, necessity always comes in, and it reminds you that your belly's still empty. Still got a long way to go. And out of necessity, then comes the reality principle. And this is all in early Freud, probably the first 10 to 20 years of his career, that these are dominant concepts. The reality principle pushes against, quote, all types of thinking that are influenced by the pleasure principle, i.e., all the forms of illusion. Right? In a religious context, I can dream about a God of justice, but, Sandra Bland, what are you going to do about that? Oh, there's a God of love and mercy. There's Sandra Bland. And she's still dead. And no matter how many times you watch that videotape, she's still dead. And she's going to be dead tomorrow. And she's going to be dead the next day. And, well, you know, there's a God of love and mercy and justice. She's still dead. And more people die every single day. And I can comfort myself with the God of love and mercy. And that comfort does not escape the fact that black people are being killed as they drive every day. Every single day. But we live in a just country, right? And I don't even need to believe in God. We've talked about this, right? The way that you can have a secular society that has that same drive for protection. And you can have the same kinds of illusions, right? So we live in America, right? And America is a country of justice. It's a democratic, beautiful example of what it should be in this world, right? You know, everything is fair. Everybody has a chance in America. Sandra Bland's still dead. Right? I mean, you don't even need to look at God. You can look at some of the secular myths that we tell ourselves, and they're just as bad. And they don't deal with the necessity of grappling with reality in the right way. They're just a comfort. And that's a hard thing to have to face. So Ricoeur reminds his readers that for Freud, religion offers, quote, a compensation for the harshness of life rather than a source of moral authority. For Nietzsche, it's a source of moral authority. Freud's like, it's just a compensation, right? Life is hard. Believe in God. A lot of churches will sell that point too, right? Life's hard. Trust God. Okay, that makes sense at a certain level, right? As, quote, the highest function of culture, end quote, religion protects us from the superior force of nature and compensates us for the sublimation of desire, the sacrifice of instincts that is demanded by social existence. And this is all Ricoeur riffing on Freud, right? So in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud acknowledges that, you know, when I'm really having a bad day, I can't just kill Jake. I might want to, but I just can't. You know, there's certain, like, I'm physically able to, I'm in a really bad mood, and Jake has that beard, and he's just looking at me, but I can't kill him, right? I have to let that go, you know? My basement floods. It's been raining a lot. I can't do anything about that. It's a harsh world out there, even for a middle-class white guy, right? It's still a harsh world. But religion gives me a compensation for all of that, right? Because if I believe in God, then I don't have to kill Jake, and I can just, you know, use my wetback and everything will be okay. Freud marks a turn, according to Ricoeur, Freud marks a turn in thinking about religion, seeing its function as offering protection instead of prohibition, and addressing itself to desire instead of fear. Right? So for Nietzsche, You can look at it as the need for protection based in fear and accusation. Freud, writing just slightly later, instead offers, I'm sorry, I did that wrong, fear and prohibition, where Freud offers desire and protection. And again, they're two sides kind of the same coin, but this one I think is a little bit more subtle and nuanced. This one's more basic and primal, right? I'm afraid I need protection, or I'm afraid, here's where prohibition and accusation play into that, right? And it keeps me afraid, and then I get that little bit of comfort. Freud emphasizes the comfort. For Ricoeur, this indicates, well, Ricoeur again, reading Freud, this indicates a nostalgia for the father as a figure who protects and consoles us. Right? We want somebody to tell us that it'll be okay and I will keep you safe. But it nonetheless indicates the illusions of the principle, or of the pleasure principle. It's based on what we wish to be true, not on what we experience as truth. And that's the problem. And we can wish for our whole lives and ignore what our experience is, but it doesn't get us any farther. Ricoeur argues that Freud's writings are more scientific than Nietzsche's, and that they lack some of the poetry and vision that Nietzsche generated. Like, Nietzsche's a blast to read. You know, very lyrical. Freud's a little drier a lot of times. You know, it's kind of a different genre, even in some of his more philosophic essays. Therefore, Ricoeur argues that, quote, Freud's tone is less lyrical than Nietzsche's. His attitude is also closer to resignation than jubilation. Right? For Nietzsche, getting rid of all of this means that you're free. Right? Sweet. You know, we've killed the idols. Now we're totally free. You know, we can pave the way for the Übermensch. And Freud's like, yeah, we can get rid of this. But even getting rid of it, right? I can say that I can predict a future in which all religion will be gone, but that's still kind of something that pleases me. It's not true of my experience now. And he can resign himself to the inevitability of the pleasure principle, even while hoping for a world in which humans aren't dominated by that. Does that make sense? He's hopeful, he's not too assured. He's a little assured, but not too assured. Ricoeur adds, though, that in his final work, Freud balances necessity, which eventually in his later works is related to the death drive, against the theme of eros, or love. And if you ever read Future of Illusion, it's not a bad book to read. It's pretty fun. Civilization and its discontents is as well. But in Future of Illusion, like, there's something that becomes poetic. Kind of, you have this mythological battle between Thanatos and death versus eros and love, and the way that those two instincts within us battle for supremacy within human life. Right? So in some ways, we're always wanting to relieve suffering. And the only way to really do that is to die. The dead don't suffer all that much, right? And there's a quiescence, there's an absence of struggle that comes when you're dead. But, I mean, that's fighting against, you know, regeneration, birth, new life. That's supposed to be a tree. That's some apples on there. A couple branches there. That's a little better. Right? I mean, there's always a desire for procreation and generation. And for Freud, at the end of his career, that's what it means to be human. That's the struggle that we face. All right, so in conclusion, Freud introduces the tragic faith in this section of the essay, and he'll develop that more in the next couple of weeks as we talk about it. But the tragic faith is a positive movement out for atheism, and it's not for the faint of heart. Right? And it's something that he wants to even avoid Freud's resignation. He can't have Nietzsche's jubilation because it's going to be hard. But when you resign yourself, and this is Kierkegaard's point in Fear and Trembling, right? Resignation is not faith. Right? You're going to lose out on what you want if you're just resigned to it. Faith requires a different kind of attitude and a different kind of orientation that moves between those. But it's still hard. And it's never going to get easier, really. Faith is hard every single moment that you have it. 2, what a tragic faith offers is a way to break out of the illusions perpetuated out of culture. And in the most banal sense, it's the notion that everything will work out okay. You don't have to believe that anymore, because it might not. You don't have to say that my suffering is meaningful, or that my struggle is redemptive, because it probably won't be. Right? You can just kind of let that go, and let that drive and those motivations fall away, because that just breeds disappointment. Well, like, wow, why isn't it working yet? Like, why isn't my struggle redeeming anything yet? I fight for justice, and there's injustice all around, and that just leads you to despair. You know? And so to just let all of that go and focus on what's real helps. But it takes a specific kind of attitude of faith that's well acquainted and familiar with tragedy. A tragic faith is willing to persevere without consolation. 3. The vision of a tragic faith, which Ricoeur has only just begun to sketch out, is one that uniquely grapples with the realities of life. Without foregoing consolations of the religious or secular origin, one cannot understand the nature of reality. Right? And so much of our lives, I mean, we have culture filtering reality to us. And it helps us avoid the reality of what's underneath it. And if we can't face the reality, we actually can't do anything with it. Right? We just engage in idle talk. And that's all it amounts to, right? We can protest, we can rally, we can do all these things, but it doesn't mean anything, because it's really not dealing with the reality of the human situation underneath. Finally, not only does the tragic faith allow Ricoeur to go beyond religion, but it also postulates the importance of understanding or appropriating one's beliefs. Right? So again, the whole point of the essay throughout is to move past both religion and atheism into a new kind of space. But really, as he's thinking and as he's talking, the reason why Freud and Nietzsche are so important is that they force us to go back and question, why do I believe what I believe? And if you think about what you believe, and again, it doesn't matter if it's secular or religious in its nature, if you really think about what you believe, you're like, it's consoling me. Right? I believe that because it's of comfort to me. Or I believe that because it accuses me. And that drives me forward to do something else. And if you can question your beliefs from those perspectives and just let them go and be mindful about them, slowly but surely you can move away from the God of morality, the God of protection, the God of prohibition, and into an uncharted territory, which is tragic and hard. But it's a more healthy and more true kind of hard. It's a better kind of struggle to have. Any questions? Okay, you have it now. We've gone through Freud. Okay, this is a different question.
Yeah.
All right.
So, like, how does the death drive play into all of this? Like, because, yeah, like the arrows and, I mean, that's kind of like a general question, but.
It doesn't quite.
Okay.
That's probably the safest and most correct answer. Right? I mean, Ricoeur doesn't really get into the death drive. I mean, he's really more worried about, he's more interested in this essay in Freud's early work, which is the pleasure principle versus the reality principle, and not into Freud's later transformations of it. And so I could give you like a huge, long, rambling answer that's probably wrong, or I can just say I don't think it deals with it and just leave it there. And I think that's probably the best way to honor Freud, is to just leave it there. It's been a while since I've read up on the death drive too, and so I feel a little bit less certain about being able to speak for that, which would move me well beyond what Ricoeur covers in this part of the chapter. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you, I'm sorry.
No, you don't have to be sorry. It's a good question. I just don't have a good answer. Other questions? Cassie?
So, how can you be sure then, or I guess you can't be sure, that this new idea isn't just as much of a filter and a separation from reality as everything else?
You can't be. And that's the tragedy of it, right? And that's why, I mean, going back to what I said midway through, that's why it's always an interpretation. And if you're aware of it as an interpretation, you're going to be far less needful of it, right? I mean, you look at how fundamentalists, and I don't care if they're atheists or religious fundamentalists, like defend at all costs that their belief is capital T true, you know, there's a lot that's kind of going on with those people, right? And if you admit that the tragedy of your faith is that it's just an interpretation, it's the best I can do for now, right? And I'm going to go along with it. It's the best I got. I've thought about it. This is the best I can do. You know, and if Jake comes up to you someday and says, Cassie, you're just consoling yourself. You're like, yeah. You know, and then you strip that away and what's left? Nothing. But you keep going on and then you realize, oh, there is something here. And you think about it, you're like, oh, okay, this is all right. But it's just an interpretation. But that allows you to be open to what Jake says and not hostile and defensive. And, you know, making fun of his beard or whatnot.
It's almost like it's better to be proven wrong at that point because
Totally.
Because you know you still can be proven wrong.
Yeah.
And that you haven't like fallen into a trap.
Yeah. You haven't fallen into the need for certainty. You're like, yeah, it's still an interpretation. It's still a work in progress. And that's the tragedy of it, because that's as good as you can get. Because you're human, you're fallible, you're limited. But you don't pretend not to be. Right? And that's the one redeeming virtue of Ricoeur's outlook, is that you don't pretend to be other than what you are. You don't pretend that the world is a place that's other than what it is. And you can live your own experiences with as few filters as possible. Does it make it easier? No, it makes it harder. It raises more questions than what it answers. And any answer that you find is only provisional. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Other questions? All right, that's our class. Thank you for coming.